It's 1898. The Anglo-Egyptian army is advancing up the Nile, and this time there will be no retreat.
At Atbara, the forces of the Mahdi are entrenched, determined, and ready to fight.
What follows is not a frontier skirmish, but something far more decisive.
Because the invading army is supplied by railway, supported by gunboats, and carries enormous firepower.
Riding with the cavalry is a young Winston Churchill.
For the dramatic story that takes us from Atbara
to Omdurman and an epic cavalry charge by the British Army.
Join us on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is my companion and brave warrior, Dr. Warren Dockter.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Richard Toye. It is an honor to serve with you.
Well, fortunately, we're not under any immediate physical threat today, unlike Winston Churchill back in 1898. And I guess it's worth emphasizing that although the series of battles between the British and the Dervish army were extremely unequal, they were not without risk for people on the British side.
No, that's right. And it was interesting exactly how, as we'll come to it, some of the descriptions of the aftermaths of these battles, pretty brutal. And Churchill does share that. But just to catch our listeners up, our listeners is how some people pronounce that, we had been discussing the very methodical way which Horatio Kitchener had organized the British forces and how Churchill had joined. But the main thing that we should take away going into this is that the Mahdist state, now the Mahdi himself had passed away, but it was being run by his second in command called the Khalifa, who was a particularly brutal warrior himself. And he, I'm going to say, imbued his warriors with a fanatical belief in himself and this particular fanatical type of Islam. So these are hardened warriors. But of course, Kitchener was very methodical and understood the logistics.
Absolutely. And going to your point, the technology and sort of the means of fighting is worth remembering. We talked in the previous episode about the desert railway, but of course the Nile itself was a really important means of transport for the British forces in order to fight. Getting there was probably more than half the battle, in a sense, that it was this extremely challenging territory, extremely hot, and there are some great descriptions in Churchill's writing. Remember, he's sending articles back to the newspapers, and he's talking about the difficulties of sort of persistently having to unload and reload the boats, because periodically, as you travel up the Nile, you reach so-called cataracts, waterfalls, which are going to prevent you going further on your steamer. So you have to keep getting out, moving upstream, and all the equipment, all the weapons, all the ammunition, you've got to move that as well.
That's right. So logistically, it had been a real difficult thing for the British Empire to police this part of the world. Previously, they had relied solely on the Nile River, which changes from season to season. And so Kitchener had this idea of using the railroad and technology. But as you say, getting there was half the battle, which brings us to the first major skirmish, or I think it's fair to call it a battle, the Battle of Atbara. And the tactics employed here by the Dervish and their army is that they had entrenched themselves in what's called a zariba, which is a thorn fortification that's about 6 to 8 feet tall. It's a really remarkable thing. So Kitchener sees this thorn fortification and orders a direct assault.
So, I mean, that's a pretty daunting thing to do. Dervish forces are armed with spears, but still running against people who are going to be sort of throwing these things at you, even if you've got revolvers and rifles, is still a frightening prospect.
No, that's right. Churchill would later say about it that the Battle of Atbara, and you mentioned them using spears, was perhaps the most complete victory ever gained by the British arms in the Sudan. So he's emphasizing the role of the rifles against the spears and the men armed with swords. But the direct assault, of course, creates really brutal close quarters combat. But one of the things I think, when I write about this in my book, is that Churchill writes about the Dervish with an almost admiration, which I think is really remarkable compared to perhaps other writers of the day.
I mean, I think the way he writes is remarkable, but I also think that there were other people at the time who were willing to write with a degree of admiration about opponents of the British, partly on the grounds that if you've defeated a lot of extremely brave warriors, then better than if you've just massacred a bunch of people who didn't stand a chance and really wanted to run away. Now, I'm sure that wasn't true of the Dervish warriors, but you see my point that by building up as qualities of your enemy, also reinforcing your own reputation and the reputation of the army if it's not purely a walkover.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things I think is a theme for me in Churchill's writing, particularly as we talked about him in India, that he frames his enemies in a flattering light in order to big up what they're trying to achieve, right? I mean, I think you can see that at work in his writing. Although I think his writing for this and his dispatches, and certainly in the book The River War, which we'll come to later, is far more clinical. But I do think you still see traces of this in his dispatches.
Absolutely. And again, thinking about the way in which he's trying to communicate with the public at home, a lot of what he is doing, of course, is writing about his journey and the sort of the conditions and what he's seeing of the Egyptian cavalry, and a lot of anticipation and a lot of description actually of the Nile. And here from one of his dispatches in August, he's saying that the Nile colors all of one thought. And he says, we've been traveling on and along the Nile for hundreds of miles when we disembarked at Wadi Halfa, and then we cut across nearly 400 miles of desert by rail. And here at Atbara, we strike the river again, broader than ever. So this talking about this tremendous volume of brown, muddy water whose surface resembles that of a deep lock when it is being filled. So he puts a lot of effort into finding striking images in order to make this stuff seem exciting to people at home who might not be thrilled to say, well, you went on a train and then I went on a boat.
Yeah.
There's also he does have, obviously he's well known for his sense of humor, but he is also capable of self-mockery as well. I think that's important. So writing it, after this long passage about the river, he says, if I had not an hereditary shrinking from publicity of all kinds and were to write a book about this campaign, I should call it the War for the Waterway. Now, we know, in fact, in due course, he calls it the River War, but so he's fairly close to what he comes up with. And it shows he is already thinking about writing a book at this stage. Also shows he's well aware of his reputation for being a bombastic, publicity-seeking kind of guy.
Right. Yeah. So he describes the aftermath of the Battle of Atbara, and he describes the scene of the Zariba after the storm was one of terrible confusion and carnage. I mean, he doesn't spare his readers, but at the same time, as you say, he's using the romanticism, the drama of this to encourage his readers to keep reading. And so even though he wasn't at the Battle of Atbara, you still get a sense of the danger.
Exactly. And he's talking about riding across the desert, sort of literally trying to catch up with the British forces, reaching a camping ground and then finding it deserted and that the troops he's looking for had already marched. So he's actually talking to some of the local people, maybe with some difficulties of communication. And there's this local colour which he is trying to get into his dispatches for the readers back home to create an exotic picture, really.
Well, I think also one of the things that comes across in his reading, as we're approaching Omdurman and he's catching up with the British Army, he describes, and it's certainly true in his book later on, the slow, steady, methodical advances the British are making between the Nile and the railway system working together. He presents the British Army as a mechanized force. And I think it's really interesting because for the reader, it creates a psychological feeling of inevitability. And that is that there will be a final showdown that we're slowly inching towards, which, of course, we arrive at Omdurman.
Yeah, and it is amazing. He is writing this up as well as he's going along and finding a way to post it back, and it gets back to London and it gets published in the press. And as you say, it could be really exciting for the readers back at home to I really want to get the next installment of this stuff. He does catch up with the British forces and marches with them, and starting to talk about the low scrub is alive with nimble figures of spearmen. On horseback, the emirs direct the attack. The swarm of men burst into the open ground at a swift run. And so he's describing, experiencing this attack. And again, he is making clear that in a way it's touch and go. And so I am told that had the enemy made a second attack, they would have destroyed the entire British force. So there's a lot of this story of how I got there, but that is mixed up with drama and violence, which is very vividly described.
Which he's excellent at doing. And I do think if we think about him as a writer, I mean, you can see how he's really cutting his teeth on this stuff and knowing his audience, which would later go on to him later down in his career, be a huge influence, not just in how he writes for his audience, but how he writes his speeches for his constituents. You can see him almost cooking in this book and developing his craft, which I think is really interesting. I mean, I say book, in his dispatches. And then, of course, we arrive at the Battle of Omdurman. But before, and I think we discussed this briefly last time, when he actually met with Kitchener, whom, of course, you remember he was completely terrified of seeing prior to the battle because he had kind of conned his way into this.
Yeah. And by 5th of September, he's actually made it all the way to Khartoum, which is kind of adjacent to Omdurman. And he says, writes his word Khartoum at the top of the letter. He says, it is with a feeling of exultation that I write it big and black at the top of the page. The fact that a European can again in safety and confidence post a letter from such a situation has alone a deep significance. But he talks about, and this is setting the scene for the battle, which will soon take place, sort of a black solitary hill rose between the cavalry position and Omdurman. A long, low ridge running from it concealed the ground beyond. And there was a huge plain, and a river framing what would be the battlefield. And he says it was deserted, not a living soul could be seen. So there he is, literally setting the scene for the Battle of Omdurman, this immense battle in which he would risk his life. And we'll talk about that after the break.
Welcome back to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is Professor Richard Toye, the Maxim gun to my Mauser rifle.
Yeah, when anyone says Maxim, I think I'm going to get to go to a French restaurant, but maybe not in this case. So it's the 6th of September, 1898. And at 4:30, all the bugles all over the camp started sounding. And so this is like 4:30 in the morning, I should emphasize. Everybody's waking up while the moon is still full. And people start eating porridge, sausage, biscuits, bully beef. Cavalry start mounting their horses. The infantry stand to arms, and the gunners go to their batteries. And as Churchill puts it, the sun rising over the Nile displayed the wide plain, the dark rocky hills, and the waiting army. It was as if all the preliminaries were settled, the arena cleared, and nothing remained but the final act and the rigor of the game.
What a powerful quote. I remember reading it in his description of the Dervish army is really powerful. He talks about seeing all the banners with Arabic writing glittering in the morning sun, and this really dramatic scene. And of course, what we know and that Churchill was becoming aware of is that he would take part in an enormous full cavalry charge, arguably one of the last full cavalry charges the British Empire ever did. Now, this is disputed.
Well, yes. I mean, there were, I believe, still some cavalry charges in the First World War. Probably not really a terribly good idea, because obviously in this situation, as we will see, the cavalry charge, even against people who are only equipped with spears, could be a very risky business. And so, as you say, he does this description of the sort of the dervishes beginning to stretch out over the Kareri plain. So these are absolutely enormous numbers of people, apparently still confident. I mean, these are people who are basically about to get massacred, and either they don't realize the danger that they're in, or they're brave enough not to care. Churchill estimates them at around 7,000 in perfect array. So these dervish warriors are advancing towards a large number of British guns. So they are at this point about 2,000 yards from the 32nd Field Battery, and also there are gunboats as well. Remember, it's still on the Nile, and really it's just a question of waiting for for the dervishes to come fully within range. You don't want to shoot too early, obviously, and so the British hold their fire until they're within the correct range. And when the 32nd Battery unleashes its fire, about 20 shells struck these advancing forces within the first minute. And again, this is Churchill's own estimate. Some are bursting high in the air and missing their target. Others are exactly exploding in front of their faces. Some are plunging into the sand and sending up clouds of dust and splinters. So even in the face of all this, the men continue to advance, and so it seems almost incredible how much they can continue to press on in the face of really being slaughtered.
I guess it's at this moment, as they're approaching under artillery fire, that the artillery would have stopped and they would have sounded that there would be a cavalry charge. And I've always thought it's really interesting. Of course, Churchill was a part, and he's there with the 21st Lancers. And as I understand it, traditionally in a full cavalry charge, most of the 21st Lancers would have literally carried lances as a part of their charge. And Churchill didn't because he had hurt his shoulder.
Yeah, that had happened getting off ship when he was first arriving in India. And so he had this persistent injury, which gave him trouble throughout his life, I think.
So as a result, he could not carry the lance into the full charge as most of the 21st Lancers did, which may have saved his life.
Well, indeed. So to kind of set up the story of how that happened, about 8:15 in the morning, 21st Lancers move out of the Zareba. So the British are almost using Sudanese technology. They've realized that this method of defense is a good one. They come out of there. They fire a few shots at Dervish who were sort of skirmishing on the upper slopes. And the idea is to harass the enemy's right and to try and cut off the dervishes from the city of Omdurman. And so they advance slowly, and they see about 200 dervishes crouching in what seems to be a small ditch or gully. And they try to clear out the people who are seeking protection there to make sure that they can't pose a threat to other troops. And so British Army approach, and having been coming up to what they thought were men with spears, they are suddenly fired upon. So the dervishes aren't completely without guns. And so there's an order to turn right, and the regiment starts to gallop directly towards these dervish riflemen. Yet this is where it turns out that they're in for a really nasty surprise.
That's right. So they're bearing down on the dervish who are behind the hillock in the ditch, for lack of a better word. And I think Churchill's thrown from his horse, isn't he?
Well, I mean, let's see what he says. So they're finding out that there's far more people there than they were expecting to encounter. And so they basically ride directly straight into this mass of dervishes. The riflemen are continuing to fire, and they basically go straight into this ditch. Their dervishes are hacking and trying to knock the cavalry, the 21st Lancers, off their horses. Plenty of people killed or wounded. So the regiment, the force of the regiment breaks through the dervish line. There's also men have fallen from their horses. There is riderless horses galloping across the plain, or people just clasping onto their saddle, lurching about, covered in blood from huge numbers of wounds. And so the dervishes have been shaken somewhat, but they managed to retreat still in relatively good order. So although he doesn't say it in the original dispatch, Churchill has been firing and has succeeded in killing a number of people. I think that he's not entirely sure whether it's 3 or 5, but he's right in the middle there.
Yeah. And so, no, I guess he wasn't actually thrown from his horse like I had thought, but he's immediately in this confused, violent space. And again, because he's not carrying a lance, he's able to actually draw that pistol and fire upon his opponents with that, which was probably far more a successful weapon for him than had he used the lance or his sword. But you can see that as all these British cavalrymen charge the group of Dervish there, that it would be close quarters combat. It would be incredibly chaotic and incredibly violent. So Churchill's thrown it, in a first person sense. He's really a part of it. He's no longer just writing about this war, he's in it. And I do think it's remarkable that he basically counts somewhere between potentially 3 or 5 people that he himself had killed as a result of this. And so Dervish forces turned and fled, which ultimately freed the British up to Omdurman itself and closed the battle.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, the Churchill describes this even in more detail in his book My Early Life many years later. He isn't quite so personal in the dispatches, but he's very vivid in his later recollections. And he says, sort of, in one respect, a cavalry charge is very like ordinary life. So long as you are all right, firmly in your saddle, your horse in hand and well armed, lots of enemies will give you a wide berth. But as soon as you've lost a stirrup, have a rain cut, have dropped your weapon, are wounded, or your horse is wounded, then is the moment when from all quarters enemies rush upon you. And so he's acknowledging the fact that there were other people with him who were killed, whereas he himself, because he does manage to stay on his horse, is able to shoot and kill people, as you say. Suddenly, in the midst of the troop, up sprang a dervish. How he got there, I do not know. He must have leaped out of some scrub or hole. I shot him at less than a yard. He fell on the sand and lay there dead. How easy to kill a man, but I did not worry about it. So again, the whole situation was far worse for the dervishes. These were traumatic events for Churchill and his comrades to live through as well.
That's right. And even though it was a success, I mean, it was a very brutal campaign at the end. I mean, once the actual charge was over and the battle was won, they went into Omdurman and Khartoum and had seen, and we had discussed this, how the Mahdi had lived. He remarked about his bathroom, but he also noticed, and this is something that would become a sticking point later for him and Kitchener, is that he noticed that Kitchener had bombed the tomb of the Mahdi. And Churchill thought that was a needless thing. And according even to Churchill's friend, Wilfred Scowen Blunt, Horatio Kitchener found the Mahdi's body and actually cut his head off and kept it in a kerosene can. Now, you got to take some things with a grain of salt that Wilfred Blunt says, but Blunt also really disliked Kitchener, and Churchill really thought Kitchener behaved very ungentlemanly after the Battle of Omdurman. And even publicly spoke about it.
There's also this very famous dispatch which Churchill writes on 10th of September from Camp Omdurman about the appearance of the battlefield after the fighting was over. And he talks about horrible sights. He talks about not only the scene, but he talks about the dreadful smell as well of decaying bodies. This is a really horrible description of the heaps of dervish dead and wounded people who are still alive but clearly going to die. He does describe another soldier, Lord Talibardine, who was actually giving out water to wounded people. Obviously, the humane gesture, but it wasn't going to save their lives. And there is an acknowledgement of the painful and shocking nature of the aftermath here. I would again say Churchill wasn't the only person to draw attention to this. There were plenty of Victorian journalists, particularly on the liberal side, who were willing to mention and condemn the brutality of essentially massacring people. They weren't completely unarmed, of course, not only spears, but as we said, they had some rifles as well. So Churchill is not alone in this. He does, however, reach a conclusion which is more benign. He looks forward to this as being part actually of a civilizing process, so that he foresees or predicts a day in a distant age when there'll be a huge system of irrigation that will turn this desolate plain into a fertile garden, and that the memory of the battle will be not entirely forgotten, but it will fade into the distance. So I think that what's going on here is that he acknowledges the human suffering, but ultimately he thinks that it all is in a good cause of trying to spread what he regards as a more benign form of civilization.
Right. I mean, you can see that the methodical march of the liberal empire that he empathizes with, that he wants to champion, is basically saying, hey, this is chaotic, it is terrible, but ultimately it will be worth it because it will create farm yields and irrigation that will help sustain all of Egypt.
So what does this do for Churchill's career as a whole, do you think?
So I think a couple things. The first is, again, he's become not just a one-off reporter now. He's got a brand that he can live on as a writer, and we see that is very successful. At some point, we'll have to do the Boer War, and when he does those dispatches, and he becomes, as we know in that, almost a household name. So he's already building his brand. He's becoming known. But I also think that it's almost like he's earned his stripes now. He's not just some guy writing. I think that's one of the things that later on people would really respect, the fact that he actually served in this cavalry charge and saw actual action.
Yes, I think that's true. I suppose I would also say that he does turn this into a very big book, The River War that we mentioned earlier, in 2 volumes, subsequently edited down into 1 volume. Some of the criticisms of Kitchener at that point kind of edited out. Was that a form of political opportunism? But it's a very hefty piece of research as well. It's not just writing up the dispatches in a dash it off, make a few bucks way. It is something which involves him using his connections to get insider accounts, insider information, and it's not only a weighty book in the literal sense. It's certainly a serious work of history.
Well, it is, and when I've spoken to people that research that particular era of history, the history of Egypt, when I was doing my own research, I mean, Churchill's history of this war is still considered one of the primary books you have to read. I mean, so I think you can also see, this is me projecting far in the future, but you can see him developing his writing as a historian, which would later be history of the English-speaking peoples and perhaps the biography of his own father later in the Edwardian period. But you get those touches of him working on that side, the research end of the craft. And I think it's a very successful, interesting book. I think it's actually one of his better books, The River War.
So this then leaves the situation. Churchill has witnessed fighting in Cuba. He's participated in fighting in India and now in Sudan. That leaves the question for him of, what do you do next? Do you keep going to every war that the British are going to fight? Or is this a time where he can start to try and engineer that move into politics, which he's really always aspired to?
Right. I mean, and that's probably a good place to close, but we know that the real place he wants to get to is politics.
Yeah, he wants to move from the Battle of Omdurman to the Battle of Westminster. At Atbara, the Dervish army was broken.
At Omdurman, it was destroyed.
Not for lack of courage, but for lack of means.
Against rifles, Maxim guns, and an army that moved as a single machine, courage alone could not prevail.
And Winston Churchill saw this clearly as a soldier and as an observer of a new kind of war.
Where technology decides the outcome before the battle is even joined. Next time, we turn to another significant episode in the dramatic life of Winston Churchill.
Exactly 100 years on from Britain's general strike, we explore Churchill's role in government during the most significant industrial unrest in the nation's history.
That's right here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.